Hi, this is Layla with the MADTASTY team, and I am particularly excited for today's MADTASTY session because I have the opportunity to sit down with Eloise Theisen, a veteran board-certified nurse practitioner who worked in the oncology field for over 14 years and pivoted to her own cannabis practice about 7 years ago, and to date has treated approximately 6,000 patients. Thanks for joining me today, Eloise. Before we dive into some questions, I wanted to mention to our community why your practice has such a great reputation in the alternative medicine space. You are one of the first practices to bring a clinical dosing regimen to the cannabis space, and you are treating a wide range of conditions and diseases, including pain, insomnia, anxiety, and depression for mostly senior patients. But those are common in all ages, and I am very curious to hear about your patients' results. I'm going to have to consult my notes here, but in addition to running your own practice, you are the president of the American Cannabis Nurses Association, an author, a faculty member at Pacific College Health and Sciences, a senior advisor for Circle Labs, and the CEO of Radical Health, a cannabis education and training company that focuses on healthcare professionals. So to get started, I wanted to ask what initially attracted you to medicine and particularly oncology.
Yeah, I had to kind of think back there. I've been in nursing now for over 20 years, and my family's history, we've always had some really complex medical conditions in our family. My uncle was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease at the age of 34. He ended up passing away several years later. So it's really unusual to see someone so young get that disease and die. And I had an aunt who developed melanoma in her sinuses, which is also a very rare place to find and diagnose melanoma. She died at 44. So I was exposed at a very young age to cancer and rare illnesses, and I became a caretaker as a result of it. I became very curious about how I could help people with their suffering, especially towards end of life, because that was the exposure I got as a young child, was watching some of my family members suffer. Not just the person with the disease like my aunt and uncle, but also my mom and my grandma and my grandpa. So I think I was just sort of born to become a caretaker. And oncology became interesting to me particularly because you end up developing relationships with these patients that are long-term. Often cancer has now become a chronic disease. So you spend a lot of time with these patients and you really get to know them and their families, and it almost feels like they become family. So it's very... what's the word I want to say? It's very humbling to be able to care for people when they're at sometimes their worst and most vulnerable times.
Wow, Eloise, thank you so much for sharing. It seems like maybe some of those experiences drove you to help patients with terminal illness, and I'm curious, what steered you in the direction of cannabis as a treatment for those patients? Was your interest specifically for oncology patients, or was something else driving you towards plant-based medicine?
My trajectory into the cannabis world was definitely not what I expected. I never expected myself to be a cannabis consultant or a cannabis nurse practitioner. I call myself an accidental entrepreneur, as I found myself in a place where I had to reinvent myself as a nurse after suffering from a tragic car accident that left me disabled, where I lost my job. I didn't work for many years. And I chose to use cannabis for my own health and wellness, and had such a remarkable experience that I was able to go back to school to become a nurse practitioner. And that was a lifelong goal of mine that I had always wanted to accomplish. And while I was doing my hours for my certification, I was in an oncology practice. And, it just happened to be that patients every day were asking me about it and really curious about how they could use it within their own treatment to help relieve their suffering and improve their quality of life. And I had extensive knowledge because I'd used the cannabis medicine for myself and studied the plant pretty intensively. I remember being pretty upset at first when I came to cannabis as a medicine because it worked so well and so quickly. I just thought, why aren't we offering this to our patients? And then, of course, you get into the history of cannabis, and it becomes quite obvious with the history and the stigma and the Schedule I status. So I became a resource during my clinical hours for this oncology clinic. And at the end of it, I just started to really recognize how patients wanted someone to hold their hand, help navigate them through this so that they could improve their successes with it. So even though I was offered a position at the end of my rotation, I declined it because I really wanted to kind of take a leap of faith here and do something that I felt was really going to demonstrate improved outcomes for patients. And I started my practice with Dr. David Ferreira in 2014, and since then have watched it grow over the last 6 years.
Wow, Eloise, I cannot believe that you were able to take a personal traumatic experience and make it a template for treating others living with severe disabilities or ailments. And it sounds like this journey you've been on has been driving your passion for this practice. When you were introduced to the cannabis plant and how effective it was, but wasn't widely used in the medical space, I'm thinking the lack of research was due to the federal regulations around the plant, and I'm wondering how you figured out what variations or extracts were most effective and how to dose your patients.
Yeah, that's a question I get all the time, right? How do you use it? How much do you take? How often do you take it? And unlike the traditional setting, we are given protocols based on large clinical trials where we study patients, give them dosages, record their side effects, the outcomes. And so we have this information as clinicians to guide us. And with cannabis, it's not like that. It wasn't like that, especially in the beginning. A lot of the research that I was finding was, animal data. It wasn't necessarily done in humans. And so I started really looking at the animal data, really trying to understand the different components of the cannabis plant, cannabinoids, terpenes, different routes of administration, and using that information to help apply it to practice. So I would start working with patients, of course, taking some of the things that we do in our traditional model with going low and slow, applying those types of practices to the cannabis plant and the cannabis patient, and really started recording that data. How did it affect them? When did it affect them? Did it take an hour? Did it take 10 minutes? And starting to gather what I call best practices around different routes of administration, different cannabinoid profiles for different conditions. And, so a lot of times when I'm meeting with a patient and I go through their health history, I do have enough data now after 6,000 patients to say, okay, here's where I think we should start. But we still can individualize it. There's always going to be those outliers where some will work really well, some won't respond at all, and some will respond no matter what I do, right? So it was, I think, some of the hardest work up front for me to do was, feeling some of that stress around not having, guidelines or a toolkit or a protocol to work with for my patients. What I did discover, though, was that the plant is so safe, and we have studied the safety of this plant to the point where I felt confident and comfortable as a clinician to know that as I helped patients, titrate up and explore this plant, they were going to continue to, do well, and I wasn't concerned about their safety. I wasn't concerned about them overdosing. I was concerned about them over-consuming, and so a lot of that education is part of what I work with so that people get the right amount as soon as possible and don't over-consume.
With that said, I know that both hemp and the cannabis plant have THC, CBD, hundreds of other cannabinoids, terpenes, as you mentioned, and I'm assuming your patients have a wide variety of needs, and you give them different formulations consisting of the various cannabinoids. How are you sourcing your medicine and making sure they have the right variety?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's different ways that the different cannabinoids are going to affect someone. And because my practice is primarily the older adult, the average age of my patient is 76. They're cannabis naive. They've actually never consumed cannabis before. And they're often very afraid and skeptical of THC. THC can be wonderful for pain and sleep and anxiety when used in the right amounts. CBD can be wonderful for those things as well. And so when I'm looking to help dose my patients, I'm helping them identify products that have met certain criteria. Have they been tested, full panel testing? We want to make sure there's no pesticides, there's no molds, there's no heavy metals. We know the potency of it, so we can feel confident as a consumer and as a clinician that what they're taking is going to actually produce the result we expect. We talk about purity of products. We talk about potential side effects and really preparing them for those potential side effects so that they can feel ready if it happens and know that they can, reach out to me if they're having these side effects. So, I always like to answer these types of questions with it depends. There's so many factors that we should be considering when we're coming up with a protocol for our patients, whether that's THC or CBD or CBG or CBDA. I'm very fortunate in California to have access to about 8 different cannabinoids that I can help patients explore with. And, my philosophy is to start with one cannabinoid at a time. It doesn't mean an isolate necessarily. I can do a full spectrum THC product or a full spectrum CBD product. But that really allows us to identify how it's going to affect them, if they're having side effects, if they're having benefits. It's very clear as to what cannabinoid is producing those results.
Well, that actually rolls into my next question. How has your patient base changed over the 20 years you've been practicing, and are you seeing more people seeking out plant-based medicine?
Yeah, so in California we had medical cannabis since 1996, and in order for patients to access it legally, they had to get a physician's recommendation, and that recommendation allowed them to go into the dispensaries. The model wasn't necessarily set up for physicians to actually provide guidance and recommendations on products because it's a Schedule I drug. So it's almost like physicians were put in this really awkward position where they could recommend and certify a patient, but they weren't necessarily feeling confident that legally they could tell their patients where to go and what to get and how to take it. So in 2018, when legalization went into full effect, many patients bypassed getting that recommendation from a physician because they didn't need it in most cities and counties. And so they went straight into the dispensary. And we did see an increase in acceptance of cannabis when it became legal versus when it was medical. So again, a lot of the older adults that were curious about it were going into the dispensaries and receiving advice from dispensary staff who may or may not have gotten training. There's no scope of practice for them. There's no standardization. And, I think a lot of people are trying to self-regulate their cannabis use, and working with a clinician sometimes can really help people get to their recommended dose and improve their quality of life quicker. It can help them save money. Sometimes I can identify other things that cannabis may be helpful with. When they came to me maybe just for sleep, maybe we identify they have some anxiety as well. And sometimes I can help them switch up their treatment protocol. If they were initially having success and now they're no longer having success, they think that cannabis isn't necessarily working for them anymore, but often it just means we have to maybe change the route of administration, maybe change the type of product that they're using could be really helpful. And sometimes we do see where people, I think inadvertently or unintentionally overconsume, their tolerance goes up, their dose goes up, and then it becomes ineffective and they actually start having some unwanted side effects, depression, anxiety, insomnia, which seems sort of counterintuitive because a lot of times that's what people are coming to cannabis for. So in those cases, it's really important that a healthcare provider is following up and following through with your care. So if that happens, again, it doesn't mean you can't use cannabis. It just means we have to explore how we're going to use it differently so that you get maximum benefit from your protocol.
So do you see any progress in the public or private sectors on testing the efficacy of cannabinoids?
Yeah, isn't that $1 million question? Not necessarily in the United States, but in other countries, yes. We're seeing great research come out of Israel. And I think that as long as it remains a Schedule I drug here in the United States, we're going to have a really hard time getting the kind of clinical trials to demonstrate efficacy that we want, right? Because what we currently use in any human trials that are approved in the United States comes from the farm in Mississippi, where the THC content does not accurately reflect what most states that have a medical or adult use program are using. So it's a very low THC, almost closer to hemp, I would say, than really, a high like a type 1 cannabis THC plant. I think many people may be afraid to volunteer for these studies as long as it's a Schedule 1 drug, because they can't be guaranteed that they're not going to be, put in jail or get in trouble for it, or the stigma and their family members don't necessarily approve it. So, we do see, I think a perfect example is women who are pregnant and breastfeeding, who have, for generations in some countries like Jamaica, have been using ganja all throughout their pregnancy and breastfeeding. And here in the United States, it's still very taboo to use cannabis, because most clinicians are going to say there's not enough research for us to feel confident that what you're using is safe. We don't know the risks and benefits. And I feel like as a woman and a mother, that it's important to me that I have the information that I need to make good, educated decisions. And I can't do that with cannabis, because, again, you're not going to get a lot of these women who want to volunteer for it because they're not sure of the safety or the efficacy or the stigma, or, potentially getting in trouble, if they are going to volunteer for these studies, and then, the government comes in and says, we're going to take your kid away. I mean, there's just so much rich history there to give them enough fear to where, even if we could do these studies, I don't know how many volunteers we'd actually get. I would love to see it be more of a first choice rather than a last choice. A lot of our patients, a lot of people that come to me, the question I love to ask them is, well, why now? What brought you to cannabis now? And, it's either, my grandson was, really encouraging me to use it, or I've tried everything else and it doesn't work, and I'm out of options and I don't have anything left to lose. And, that's sort of heartbreaking, right? If we could prevent all of that pain and suffering by offering them something that has, we do actually have really good research to demonstrate that cannabinoids are effective for chronic pain. Yet it's never offered, as far as I know, as a first-line treatment for our patients. And, we have this huge opioid crisis. So, why aren't we, trying to change our practices right now? Well, that's the stigma, that's the Schedule 1 status. So I think, there's a lot of us out there that are really trying to educate and advocate for the plant and for the patients, because they're using it. And it's really important that we help them use it properly and safely and effectively.
So if one of your patients asked you the difference between hemp and cannabis, what would you say to them?
That's a great question, and it's a question that comes up a lot right now. We have the cannabis sativa plant, and under that umbrella you've had the term marijuana, which we're trying to move away from, and hemp. And now what we're seeing is that people are starting to classify it in different types. So you have type 1, which is predominantly a high THC type. You have type 2, which is usually a combination of CBD and THC, and you have a type 3, which is predominantly CBD. These are called chemovars or cultivars. Some people call them strains. And really, I think the reason why we're trying to move away from hemp versus marijuana is because it's really confusing. Often, historically, the hemp plant has been used for industrial purposes, ropes, textiles, and now we're seeing these cannabis plants that are very low in THC that qualify as a hemp plant because the THC is 0.3% or less. And so, hemp has gotten a really bad name out there, and I think now we're really starting to see companies that are paying attention. They're trying to, use plants that are grown and flowering, like the cannabis plant, hemp plants that grow and flower, that are low in THC, that are rich in cannabinoids and terpenes, and can be used properly for medicines, where they can extract the oils, versus some companies historically have used the stalk and stem of the hemp plant. So, it gets really overwhelming and confusing for patients to try to navigate or work through some of that information. And CBD, whether it comes from the hemp plant or it comes from the marijuana cannabis plant, is the same molecule. So it should be effective if you're using CBD from hemp versus cannabis, as long as you're getting a product from hemp that has been grown to produce the flowers. You're looking at the test results to verify the potency. You're making sure it's free of molds and heavy metals and contaminants, things like bacteria. So you certainly can use a hemp CBD product for wellness and health out there.
So one thing that you shared with me that really hit me is that cannabis is usually a last resort treatment. So I'm wondering how people, number one, find you and or someone else in their area.
Yeah, sometimes people call me a unicorn, right? It's like, oh, they found me. So my practice is Radical Health, and it's RADICLE healthcare.com. You can read more about me there, and my business partner, Tim Byers, for the education and training. You can actually book an appointment with me there as well. I think there are not very many cannabis clinicians. Some of us in the space have experienced some, name calling from our peers, and when we try to encourage others to get involved in the space, often the response I've received in the past is, well, I don't want to be considered a pot doc or a pothead or a drug dealer. But you do have organizations like the Society of Cannabis Clinicians. They do have a clinician locator through their you also have the American Cannabis Nurses Association. So you have some cannabis associations, nonprofit associations, where they are getting large members who are interested, who are becoming educated and starting to come out and practice and consult or educate or coach patients on how to use the plant safely.
Well, Eloise, I really appreciate the time you took to answer my questions today and educate me and the community on your practice and what you're doing. And I think a lot of people are going to be reaching out to you via your website and giving you a call.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I'm always grateful to have an opportunity to share the great work that we can do with cannabis.